I'm Mr. Tom, and I like to paint silly things. Welcome to Acutely Believable Creatures. Welcome, friends and homies. Thanks for coming along on another art adventure with your new best friend, me. This week's theme is supervillain, and it's brought to us by our delightfully talented friends on one of my favorite Discords. After trolling the deep, dark recesses of my dad brain, I found a pun of an idea that would work out perfectly. May I introduce to you the AXElotl. After trolling Pinterest for a while for some ideas, I started sketching. I'm pretty happy with the sketch so far. I wanted an exaggerated tail, a slightly evil face, with wild flowing AXElotl side face flappy things. So this works for me. Now again, it's not easy getting the eyes just right when you only use 2 dots, so this part took a couple of tries. There's no shame in it. That's why they make erasers. But, yeah, that'll do. Now we'll just march our paper over to the guillotine. Now we're going to use our magic light box to transfer our sketch to our watercolor paper. Now, line weight isn't an issue here. What's line weight? That's a solid question. That's just fancy art talk for line thickness. Why doesn't it matter here? Another good question. Because any mark we make now will show up through our paint later. Basically, we just want to make a coloring book page with really light lines. It seems like every week I make a joke about having to taper paper down before painting, but the truth is, you can actually skip this step if you stretch your paper. How do you stretch watercolor paper? Another solid question. Basically, stretching a watercolor paper is pretty easy. It just takes some patience, which, if we're being honest, is not my strong suit. The short of it is you have to drench your paper first and then lay it out onto a dry board before painting. The downside is there's extra pressure not to mess up because you lose all that time and all that prep work. And honestly, I don't need that evil in my life. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk about paint and color schemes. Now, a non-mischievous AXElotl is pinkish in color, so obviously, an evil one is purplishly black and bluish with accents of pink. There's lots of wet blending here. Going through with a clean brush to lay down some water, then strategically plopping and blooping some colors here and there. That'll start that magical blending process as it dries. Just lightly dragging some colors into each other, but not too much. If you do too much, they'll dry kind of muddled, and instead of making a cool gradient, it'll make this muddied, kind of unsaturated yuck. And if you're going for like a spooky, cute vibe, yuck is not really your goal. This part is always stressful. Not the mouth, but adding the darkest part to the painting. No matter how light you start, you can always go back and darken things up. But if you start too dark, trying to fix that is a losing battle. I can't tell you how many paintings I've ruined by trying to rush this part, so before I start, I'll get up, I'll lock the door to the studio, and I'll hold my breath until I get all of the color laid in. Even watching this is making me a little anxious. Now the hard part's done, let's do a wash over the whole thing. A watercolor wash is a nice subtle touch. It is not a necessity, but it's nice. First, you want to water down your paint so it's mostly water. If I had to bring math into this, I'd say it's like a 10-to-1 ratio. Washes help blend and soften some edges where colors dried and met. A wash can also tint the overall area that you're painting. In this case, I want to lighten and blend the whole vibe, so I'm going to use a really watered down pink wash. It won't be a dramatic step, but we'll all know it's there. Now, watercolor paint varies in properties from brand to brand. Some reactivate really easily when you re-wet them. So if you notice your pigments wandering a bit too far while you're washing it, consider being less generous with the mix overall. Also, you want to be careful to avoid any colors that you don't want to incorporate in your wash. Say like the mouth there, it's pretty dark, and those tail phalanges, yeah, let's call them that. They're also really dark, so I didn't want to hit them and reactivate that pigment and have it smearing around too. I'll finish the last little details off camera and let the whole thing dry thoroughly. Like, really thoroughly, before moving on to the last bits. Now we'll play the cleanup song that my 3-year-old ignores and make room for the inking process. Now seems like a good time to mention and address the elephant in the room. If you've been watching my reels and shorts, you've probably already seen the AXElotl as I painted and sketched it. Which means you probably noticed the narration of this video is slightly different. I hire a goblin to do all my short format videos while I tackle the larger process videos and plan out future projects. Goblins have a notoriously short attention span, so it's not really feasible to bring one in for a 10-minute video like this one. Now, the inking process is by far my favorite. In fact, before I discovered watercolors, I did not work in colors at all. Everything I did was just line work and, at best, grayscale. I've only been painting with watercolors for, I guess, 7, maybe 8 years. I learned everything from trial and error with a dash of YouTube tutorials. But I digress. Inking is basically the last step for me aside from some touch-ups here and there. But I learned that by inking last, I can cover up some of those not-so-crisp lines in the paint, and I can always pretend that they were intentional. Also, if I paint over the ink, it doesn't pop as much because some paints have more pigment in them, and they would be visible on top of the lines when they dry. This part I can't stress enough. Make sure your paper is dry before inking. If it's damp, you run the risk of tearing your paper as you go, and if your ink isn't waterproof, it will run and smear if you go back over it with water or paint. Now, waterproof ink or pens may sound like it's a hard to find item, but the ones I use come from a stationery store, and they're really affordable. The paper I most often use is cold press, which at least around here is the most common and easy to find. Cold press is textured, or for some art street cred, you can say it has a tooth. So after a while, it will start to wear down your pen tips, which is kind of a bummer, but I found that as long as they still have ink in them, you can get some really cool textures with the damaged tips on drawing or sketching paper. The other kind of watercolor paper is called hot press, and it's pretty smooth, almost like poster board. If anyone's interested, I can do a video on the differences between the two. In fact, if anybody has any questions, please let me know. I learned so much from YouTube that I want to give back as much as I can. Leave them in the comments, you can message me on Instagram or my website. I am always down to talk about some art. And here it is, the maniacal AXElotl. Thanks for hanging out, I really appreciate it. This should show up in my shop around the same time as this video uploads. Link will be in the description. And of course, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and that whole hot mess. And until next week, hugs and high fives.